Hi, my name is Kyla, and my topic is on Jim Crow, its impact on African Americans, and the effect it's had throughout the years. How would you feel if you saw someone deliberately change themselves in appearance and actions to portray a different race, whether it be as a joke, a Halloween costume, or just a simple experiment? In the 1830s, a white actor by the name of Thomas Dartmouth Rice, who often went by the nickname Daddy, dreamt up a new character. For this role, he would darken his face with charcoal or burnt cork. He performed this act as a part of a popular minstrel show named Jump Jim Crow. Within the show, he would dance a ridiculous jig and sing the words, "Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow." The show was extremely well received by its audiences. Thus began the rise of Jim Crow, an offensive character created with the sole intent to entertain white audiences at the expense of humiliated African Americans. This took on a whole new life as a universal symbol for segregation. Jim Crow became so directly correlated with segregation and the discrimination amongst races, and soon it was a strong force throughout the South. This put great restraints on African American life. Due to the end of slavery, Jim Crow arose as another way to display the dominance of the white population. Public places became segregated because African Americans were not seen as a race equivalent to the predominant white race. By the 1870s and 1880s, new laws began to emerge within various southern states. These new regulations became known as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were laws set in place post-Reconstruction to segregate public places within the 60 years of the original character's debut. The main purpose of these laws was to segregate public places. Facilities such as schools, restaurants, salons, hotels, theaters, and more were separated to further emphasize that blacks and whites were not meant to be together. A law created in Tennessee towards the end of the 19th century in 1891 read, "All railroads carrying passengers in the state other than street railroads shall provide equal but separate accommodations for the white and colored races, by providing 2 or more passenger cars for each passenger train, or by dividing the cars by a partition so as to secure separate accommodations." Basically, this regulation abided by the Plessy v. Ferguson Act of Separate but Equal and declared that whites and blacks were to travel in separate train cars as long as the accommodations were equal. One Jim Crow law established in Missouri in 1929 stated, "Separate free schools shall be established for the education of children of African descent, and it shall be unlawful for any colored child to attend any white school, or any white child to attend a colored school." This law prohibited integrated schools, an issue that later became a large part of the civil rights movement. Even though schools were another aspect of the Plessy v. Ferguson Act that was supposed to be separate but equal, African American students did not always receive supplies and conditions of the same equality as white students. Another rule that stemmed as a Jim Crow law was, "It shall be unlawful for a Negro and a white person to play together or in company with each other in any game of cards or dice, dominoes, or checkers." This law was established in Birmingham, Alabama in 1930. Even a small act such as playing a game of checkers was prohibited amongst differing races. Various Jim Crow laws arose during the late 1800s and earlier part of the 1900s. The severity of the laws ranged from something as simple as a black barber not being able to style a white person's hair, Georgia, to a black child not being able to be in the custody of a white person, or vice versa, in South Carolina. Interracial marriages were also frowned upon in many states including Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Maryland, Missouri, and Wyoming. Additionally, some laws followed African Americans into death. In Georgia, a rule was brought about stating, "The officer in charge shall not bury or be allowed to bury any colored persons upon ground set apart or used for the burial of a white person." Ultimately, Jim Crow laws restricted African Americans in many ways. Although the impact of Jim Crow on society made it very difficult for progress to be made, and Jim Crow laws forbade African Americans from interacting with white people, the separation was better than not having anything at all, so black people accommodated to being left to their own devices. After so many years of isolation and not having anything to call their own, African Americans learned to settle and appreciate the fact that they were being given an opportunity to establish their own places in society, even if these weren't under the best conditions. They formed black churches and other organizations. Jim Crow laws enforced the idea of an inferior race. Black and white males could not shake hands for the sole reason that they would be seen as equals. If whites and blacks were to be served in the same restaurant, which was almost a rare occasion, the white male was always to be served primarily. There was also a sign that read, "No dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans," which put African Americans and Mexicans on the same level as animals. In some way, shape, or form, Jim Crow always found its way to affect a part of an African American's life. Although it has been over a century since the birth of Jim Crow and its accompanying laws, the modern-day Jim Crow has found its way back into today's society. Today, people of color are more inclined to be seen differently than those of another race. Racial profiling is defined as the act of treating someone's background or race as a reason for them to be guilty or convicted of a crime. This is a violation of the rights inborn into U.S. citizens. It is the right of every citizen of the United States to be treated equally and not treated differently or judged prematurely based on your appearance or race. In 2005, it was shown that black people were more than twice as likely to be arrested after being pulled over, whereas white people were more than likely to be let off with a verbal warning than African Americans. In relativity to white people, black people were found to be greater than 127% more likely to be stopped and searched or frisked. A modern-day craze that almost directly stemmed from Thomas Rice himself is known as blackface. This is a somewhat short-lived phenomenon where people would paint their faces a dark black color to represent an unrealistic black person, similar to Rice's actions in Jim Crow. Some teenagers would use blackface as a Halloween costume. Even celebrities have joined in. Actress Julianne Hough dressed up in blackface for Halloween in an orange jumpsuit as a character from the show Orange is the New Black, and had to apologize for her actions days later. A movie named Soul Man was released in 1986, in which C. Thomas Howell played the role of Mark Watson, a young man who wanted to attend Harvard Law School, but there is only one scholarship open and it is reserved preferably for an African American candidate, so he takes tanning pills in order to receive the scholarship. This movie was also received terribly by critics. The Jim Crow era has reemerged as a more fitting entity for the time period, and it is not as harsh as before, but the slight discrimination and stereotypes are still there. The term ghetto is almost always associated with African Americans. Negative actions are perceived as acting black. The lack of confidence in the African American race from outside forces has driven black people to fall into the mold that society has shaped. There has been a large increase in black-on-black crime due to the lack of respect for a fellow member of the race. The feeling of being a second-class race has become part of the African American description due to society sending that message constantly. And once one is told something enough, one begins to believe it. Jim Crow has shaped society today greatly in relation to the way races are perceived, and it all began with a rising actor who wanted to be famous and get a laugh out of the crowd. Thank you.